Hello, Year 12. Welcome to our first lesson on the Philosophy of Religion unit. So for this lesson, we will be looking at ancient philosophical influences. So we'll be looking at philosophy from the ancient world. So this is pre-Christian. We'll be focusing on two philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. And the image that you can see in front of you is the Acropolis in Athens, and this is an incredibly important site because this is the site where really philosophy is supposed to have first began properly. And the two philosophers that we'll be looking at are Plato and Aristotle. They were writing in the ancient Greek world, and this is a world before Christianity. So one of the questions we can ask ourselves is why we are studying philosophers who are writing before the times of Christ. And the answer really is because the New Testament writers, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul, were Greek speakers, and they were very much influenced by the Hellenic view of the world. The Hellenic is the ancient Greek view of the world. And as we know, the New Testament was written in Greek. So much of the philosophy of the Greek-speaking world influenced the establishment of the early church and also the way in which Christianity was interpreted. So the two key figures we'll be looking at are Plato and Aristotle. And the questions that they're concerned with, or were concerned with for this unit, are how do we know? What is the nature of knowledge? When we say we know something, where does that come from? So we know from the DCT unit that the questions about knowledge are called epistemology, and that's from the Greek word episteme, which means to know. So Plato and Aristotle, incredibly important. What you can see in front of you is a painting, and this is by an artist called Michelangelo. And this painting shows Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And Plato is pointing up and Aristotle is pointing down. And we're going to analyze this this painting in a bit more detail later on. But in short, Plato believes that knowledge comes from innate ideas, which comes from our previous relationship with a world of perfection called the forms. And Aristotle believes that knowledge comes from the senses. So it comes from this world, which is why he's pointing down. Now you might ask yourself, who was Michelangelo? Well, Michelangelo was a Renaissance painter, and he was painting this in the Vatican. The Vatican is the heart of the Roman Catholic Church. So this shows the importance of these two thinkers. Christians were painting images of them. So why do we discuss Plato and Aristotle in religious studies? This is a very good question. They were not Christian. They were polytheist. So they believed in the many gods of the Greek pantheon. So we know already, we've Zeus and Apollo and Dionysius and all of the ancient Greek gods. They didn't believe in monotheism. They didn't believe in Judaism. They didn't believe in Christ because they were teaching 500 years before. So they lived before Jesus. That's the first thing we need to really get our heads around. So here's a timeline. So the first philosopher really we'll be looking at, and this is a little complex, is Socrates. And Socrates was Plato's teacher, and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Now, we're not really going to be looking at the philosophy that was proposed by Socrates because we don't really know what it is. And that's because Socrates never wrote anything down. So we have Socrates, and we have Plato, and we can see the dates here. BCE means before Christian era, so they're writing 500 years before Jesus Christ. And then we have Aristotle. So this is the chronology. So we start with Socrates, and then Plato, and then Aristotle. And then many years later, Jesus Christ is born, different part of the world. However, before this happens, Aristotle's student, let's look at the chronology here. We have Socrates teaching Plato, Plato teaching Aristotle, and then finally Aristotle teaches Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is responsible for Hellenizing the Mediterranean and far beyond it as well. And what that means is he was a conqueror and he spread Greek culture. He spread Greek culture all the way to the borders of India, actually, so towards the known world at the time. And for this reason, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle went far and wide. So the Romans would have been very familiar with Plato and Aristotle, but also more educated Jews living in Palestine at the time of Jesus. So the Christian church was heavily influenced by Greek philosophical thought. When Alexander's armies moved into Israel, Greek traditions spread through society. Early Christians were people whose understanding of the world had been shaped by Greek thinking. We might want to pause and think to ourselves, should Plato and Aristotle be as influential for Christians? Because of course they weren't Christian. And it's an interesting question, and you might think, well, no, their philosophy is irrelevant and it shouldn't really have become a part of the Christian church. But alternatively, you might think, well, if God is a God of the whole world, and Plato and Aristotle are philosophizing about the world, then the truths that they arrive at could be Christian truths. Maybe Plato and Aristotle were somehow monotheist and Christian, but they just didn't have the good fortune to have lived at the time or the time after that Jesus lived. So this is really what the early Greek thinkers, or the early church thinkers thought. They wanted to really almost baptize posthumously Plato and Aristotle. So that means they wanted to make them out to be secret Christians. Really, they were Christian, but they just didn't live at the time of Christ. So they didn't have revealed law. Okay, so we have Aristotle, who was taught by Plato, who was taught by Socrates. Okay, so let's start by looking at the broader sort of questions that are involved in this unit. So here we have a baby, and this is how we all started. This is how we all began. And babies learn. No one's born with knowledge unless you're Plato and you think you are. So how do we learn the things that we know? So think about any item of knowledge that you might have. Okay, so for example, today is Monday, or cats are felines, or water is made of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. How do you know this? There's two candidates really for this. There's innate knowledge, which we've looked at already, which means inborn knowledge. It comes with you from birth. Or there's learned experience, so seeing things and learning them through the senses. And Plato and Aristotle have two very different accounts of where knowledge comes from. Okay, so Plato is pointing up. This means he makes a distinction between this world and the next world, a higher plane of existence. Plato thinks that we don't learn anything in this world. All we do is we remember. So we simply remember what our souls have already been familiar with in a different realm of existence. Aristotle disagrees. He's pointing down. He says, no, sorry, but we only have this existence and we learn everything through exposure to this existence, so through the senses. So here's a simple piece of knowledge. So this is 2 + 2 = 4. How do we know this? According to Plato, we're born with this knowledge. We might have forgotten it, learning it isn't really learning anything new. It's simply remembering or retrieving knowledge that we already had. It comes from reason, so this is the inbuilt human faculty for being able to retrieve knowledge. And we just have to think clearly and we'll work everything out ourselves. So we know this already from the other units we studied. This would be called a priori knowledge. So this is knowledge which is known prior to experience. We can close our eyes and we can work out or rediscover everything that we thought we knew. Okay. Now we have Aristotle, not born with knowledge like this. It comes from the senses. You're taught it and you learn it. So you might simply want to pause the video at this point and just think to yourselves, which one instinctively or intuitively do you feel is true? Do you believe the Platonic idea that we're born with knowledge, or the Aristotelian idea that it comes through the senses? So you may just want to pause the video now and just think about this to yourselves. Okay, so let's start by looking at Plato. So Plato taught Aristotle, but he was taught by Socrates. So he was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was writing philosophy 400 years before Christianity. Plato was a student of Socrates. Socrates spent his life asking people difficult questions, trying to discover answers and truth. He was never satisfied with answers anyone gave him and was eventually condemned to death under the accusation of corrupting the youth of Athens. So it's important to just pause this for a second and just think about what we're dealing with here. Socrates never wrote anything down. So when we talk about Socratic philosophy and we talk about Platonic philosophy, so the philosophy of Socrates and the philosophy of Plato, we're essentially talking about the same thing. And that's because the only thing that we really know about Socrates has been told to us through Plato. So Plato expounds on his philosophy through his dialogues. And the dialogues are written down, and they're written down exchanges. And the main protagonist of these dialogues, the main thinker, the main person who is proposing ideas is Socrates. But this is a literary device. So this is Socrates through the mouthpiece of Plato. We don't really know what the historical Socrates thought because the historical Socrates never wrote anything down for good reason, and we're going to look at that in a second. So students often get a little bit confused about this. Socrates, Plato, for the sake of your essays, you may as well view them as one and the same thinker. Platonic philosophy, Socratic philosophy, it's the same sort of, it's the same view. Okay, so Plato is writing about Socrates. Socrates is this very interesting figure, okay? He constantly asked questions, according to Plato, and constantly bugged people for answers. He was eventually killed, eventually condemned to death by the ruling authorities in Athens. So Socrates himself claimed that the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. I'll say that again. The only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. This is a very interesting philosophical statement because what he's saying is that he has nothing to actually say. He has nothing to teach. And this fits in very well with Plato and Socrates' understanding of knowledge. If you believe that all knowledge is innate and learnt, then why would you teach anyone? Because everybody knows everything already. So the only thing that Socrates thinks he can do in terms of education is simply help people to access the innate knowledge that they already have. So for this reason, in one of his dialogues, Plato's dialogues called the Theaetetus, Plato has Socrates saying that his only role is as a midwife. A midwife is somebody who helps a woman to give birth. So Socrates views himself as a midwife of ideas. He's not going to teach anybody anything. He's simply going to help others to access innate knowledge. This is the reason he wrote nothing down. Why would you write anything down? So this is why he never wrote anything down. So Plato was his student and he wrote about Socrates, and so the philosophy contained in this book is called Platonic philosophy. So Plato describes Socrates' personality as difficult. His role was to antagonize, to try to discover the truth by a process called a dialectic. A dialectic is an argument. We're going to look at that in a second. So we ask people questions and try to annoy them. So let's look at how this works. Okay, so Socrates, first of all, ancient Greek philosopher. He established a critical approach to philosophy. He never wrote anything down. The only information we know about him is through Plato's writings. Socrates was eventually accused of corrupting the young minds of Athens and was eventually sentenced to death. So this is the Socratic method that Plato says that Socrates taught. Okay. Rather than telling people what is a good life, you might ask this sort of question: what do you want from life? Okay, so we begin with a question. Let's say somebody asks or answers, I want this. Then Socrates would say, well, why? And they give an answer, and then they might say, well, why? Well, why? Why? What is this? What is this? What? Every single answer is followed up with a further question. And you may recognize this in my teaching. This is the method that I try and use when I'm teaching you, the Socratic method. And it's a very famous method of teaching. You don't tell anyone anything. You simply try and draw out the conclusions that are contained within their ideas simply by asking them further questions over and over again. And it can become very annoying, as I'm sure you are aware. So he was called the gadfly. So in Athens, he was known as a gadfly. A gadfly is this annoying little fly that just buzzes around your face and never disappears. And we can see why he was called this. So Socrates was this annoying person just asking questions like, why? Tell me why? Tell me why? Tell me why? This is a sort of thing that Socrates would do. So people in Athens thought they knew a lot and were intelligent. So a typical Athenian statesman might say, well, people should be good. And we can guess what Socrates would say. Well, what does good mean? Well, they may answer and say, well, good means to be virtuous. And Socrates would say, well, what's virtue? And they might say it's behaving right in accordance with reason. And then Socrates would say, well, what's right in accordance with, over and over again, trying to get to the fundamental principles behind everybody's beliefs. Okay, so they might say there's so much beauty in the world, and Socrates would say, well, what is beauty? Or we should show justice. Well, what is justice? So this is called the Socratic method of dialectics. This is a process of relentless questioning until the truth is discovered. So Plato and Socrates obviously subscribed to this. Plato loved Socrates. He was his favorite student. So Plato writes about this in his dialogue. So Plato and Socrates both believed in this. So fundamentally, Plato and Socrates were dissatisfied with the world of appearances and wanted to scratch beneath appearances and try to discover true reality, get at what really is at the core of the world that we live in. So Plato and Socrates believe that knowledge comes from reason. It's inborn. You can't learn anything. All you can do is unravel knowledge or unravel pre-formed opinions and get at knowledge which has already been learnt or understood previously. And we're going to look at this later. We learn by remembering from a previous life. So Plato and Socrates believe in a sort of form of reincarnation. You are aware of things from a previous existence. Again, we can probably answer this question now. Why do you think he asked so many questions but didn't say anything himself? Well, he didn't think he could teach anyone. He's the midwife of other people's ideas. Okay, so this might be the kind of question that he would ask. If we look at these images on the screen now, we have some appearances here. So we have some Ribena, we have a rain cloud, we have a puddle of water, we have a can of Coke, we have a shower, and we have the ocean. What do they all have in common? Well, you might say, well, look, H2O, and that's the fundamental thing that they all have in common. This is the thing that underpins them and unites them and what they really essentially are in nature. So that's the kind of thing that Plato and Socrates are doing. Obviously, they don't know about H2O. This is long before modern science. So trying to discover true knowledge, this is called epistemology. This is the epistemic method. And we looked at this, remember, with John Hick. We said John Hick was concerned with what's known as epistemic distance, which is a Christian idea that says that God deliberately hides his knowledge of himself so that we can have a leap of faith. So that's a different idea, but it's the same word, epistemology. So trying to discover truth and knowledge. Okay, so we're going to introduce a few philosophical ideas in today's lesson. So the first one we've already done, which is epistemology. And we're going to look at metaphysics next. Okay, physics, we should know, means the laws and the material and the behavior of the physical world. Meta is another Greek word. This means above or beyond. So, what do we think metaphysics is? Maybe pause the video and think about that to yourself. Yeah, you guessed it. Above physics. So it means the world that is above and beyond the physical worlds. So trying to discover true knowledge. And if you think that true knowledge is outside of the senses, then you believe in metaphysics, the true or real nature of the world beyond the physical senses. And Plato and Socrates believed that the world as it appears to our senses is not the real or the true world. And they explore this through two key ideas. One is the idea of the cave, or the analogy of the cave from Plato's Republic. And the second is through the theory of the forms. I'm going to be looking at that. So, the world of appearances, the world that we see with our eyes, is a place that's constantly changing and constantly varied and constantly moving. So much variety. But even so, we can recognize some structures, or we can recognize some similarities between things. So what do all these images have in common? We have here a beautiful car, a beautiful sunset, a beautiful landscape, a beautiful person, and a beautiful piece of music. So what do all of these have in common? Well, for Plato and Socrates, the idea is that they all have beauty in common. And this is where it gets interesting. What actually is beauty then? Now, you know it when you see it. You recognize it, which means you must know it. However, you can't actually say exactly what it is. Take away the car, take away the sunset, take away the landscape, take away the person, take away the music, and you should have beauty that's left. But what actually is that? What do they actually have all in common? And Plato and Socrates believe that there's no real answer to this. You've never really seen beauty before. So if you've never seen beauty before, how can you recognize it? Well, the answer is you're recognizing something that you knew from a previous existence. So you've never seen beauty before. This is a really interesting idea.
So how do you know about beauty and how can you recognize it? No one ever taught you that something was beautiful. This is the idea. I mean, you might disagree and say that we are taught what's beautiful, but most people would say if they listen to a piece of music they've never heard before, no one taught them that that was beautiful. They recognize something in it. So if you're never taught it, well, where does that idea come from? So for Plato and for Socrates, they believed that knowledge can't come from the senses. It can't come from the world. You can't see beauty. And the same goes for any abstract idea, so truth or justice. You recognize justice when you see it, but you've never seen justice by itself before. You just recognize instantiations or manifestations of justice. Why is that? Plato and Socrates are going to say because it comes from a previous existence and you're simply recognizing something that you already knew. So if we're not going to use observation, we're not going to find truth from the world around us, how else can we gain knowledge? Well, knowledge doesn't come from the senses. How do we learn about the metaphysical world? How do we learn about beauty? How do we learn about truth? How do we learn about goodness? Reason. Okay, reason is so important because reason is the faculty of mind that is independent of the world of the senses. So this is the only way to find truth and knowledge, and this is because we're accessing truth that is latent or already existing in our eternal or immortal souls. So Plato will say we cannot gain true knowledge from our senses because things are always changing. So there's a few different arguments going on here. So the first argument is saying, well, look, you've never seen some of the things that you think you know. You've never seen beauty. You've seen beautiful things, but you've never seen beauty by itself. You're not looking at beauty here, you're looking at a beautiful car. So if you've never seen something before, how can you know it? Well, the only way you can know it is because you recognize it and you knew it already. So that's the first argument. The second argument is this. We think we have knowledge. We do have knowledge, but we can't get it from the senses. We can't get it from the external world because the external world is constantly changing. Always changing. How can you have a fixed idea of something when nothing remains the same for very long? And here we have the example of an apple. We all have an idea of an apple, but no one's actually seen this perfect idea of an apple. All we ever see is imperfect or constantly changing apples. So where does this perfect idea of an apple come from? So things in the material world are always changing. The issue with this is that our knowledge is not true knowledge if it comes from the external world, because truth has to be fixed forever, and we can't find fixed or stable things through experience. So Plato concludes we can never gain true knowledge of the material world using our senses, so the senses can't be trusted. By the senses we mean sight, sounds, anything that we learn through a posteriori scientific observation. And this is quite a profound statement, isn't it? He's saying that anything learnt through experience, including science, isn't real truth. It isn't real truth. It's just knowledge of changing things. It's not eternal, worthwhile knowledge. So we cannot gain true knowledge from our senses because things are always changing. So can we ever gain true knowledge then? Well, the answer will be yes, but not from this life, not from this world. So Plato, as you probably figured out at this point, is a dualist. Okay, you don't know what this term is, but you probably have an idea of it. Dual means two. So Plato believes that there are two separate sort of worlds or universes. There's the realm of appearances. So this is the world that we live in. So this is the world of cats and dogs and teachers and iPods and school books and parents and the world that we see around us, right? That you can touch, you can hear. And this is imperfect. It's always changing. Behind this world that we can't sense with touch, taste, feel, the six senses, is something more real. And this is sort of the spiritual or perfect or unchanging worlds. And Plato is going to call this the world of the forms, the world of the forms. We'll look at this a little bit later. So Plato is a dualist. He believes in two different realms, the realm of appearances and the realm of reality. I'm just going to pause the video and I'm going to ask you to ask this question of yourself. Why do you think, or how do you think, Plato's ideas influenced Christian thought? Okay, so what we have here is a diagram, a realm of truth, of reality, and a realm of appearances. Why do you think this became so popular with Christians? So we should be able to see that the reason that Christians found this so appealing is Plato seems to be describing what Christians believe to be the nature of the universe, divided between fallen world, a material world, and a world of spiritual life that's beyond this world, so heaven and earth, if you like. So Plato's a dualist. He believes in two different realms, the realm of appearances and the realm of reality. And we cannot gain true knowledge from our senses. Now, you might want to pause this and disagree and might say, well, just because the world is always changing and is never static and is always in flux, this doesn't mean we can't gain knowledge. So you might think, are there any examples of changing knowledge being a good thing? And typically people have said, well, look, evolution is an example of something that's always changing. But this is good knowledge. We can gain knowledge of things even though they're changing. Might even think of Newton's laws and think, well, look, constantly changing. Everything's in motion. But this doesn't mean that knowledge of that motion isn't useful. And critics of Plato have said that he's really devalued this world. He's devalued the world that we live in, because for Plato, really, this world doesn't mean much. It's not important. Okay, so we can never gain true knowledge and certain knowledge of things in the material world because they're constantly changing and they are imperfect. This is Plato's idea. So what can we gain true knowledge of? Well, things that are perfect and unchanging. How do we gain this true knowledge? Well, it's through reason. The only thing that can access true knowledge is our minds, and that's because we have an immortal soul that is familiar with these ideas from before birth. So reason is human logic, knowledge that doesn't require experience. So this might be called a priori in our other units. And this makes Plato a rationalist. So a rationalist is a philosopher who believes that knowledge comes from reason. So again, we have two different realms, constantly changing realm of appearances, which is not valuable, and the realm of reality, where there exists perfect ideas. And this is where the idea of the forms is going to fit in. So a very quick recap. This is the kind of thing that you'd be writing at the beginning of any essay on Plato. So Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher who was the student of Socrates. Inspired by Socrates, Plato wanted to understand the true nature of things rather than simply having a surface understanding. This process is known as epistemology. Plato disagreed that true knowledge could be gained by using our senses and instead argued that true knowledge is gained using reason. This is because the material world of sensory knowledge is always changing, so it cannot be the source of true knowledge. So we're now going to come on to Plato's theory of the forms. And this really is nothing new. This is following on from everything that's been said already. So the visible world is constantly changing and therefore imperfect. So let's take, for example, apples. We all have an idea in our head of an apple. It could be anything. It could be washing machines, could be trees, could be justice. But let's just focus on apples. Now, no one has seen a perfect apple. I'm sorry, but you haven't seen a perfect apple. Every single apple is unique and different. There's no one archetypal, which means universal, perfect apple. We have rotting apples, we have misshapen apples, we have nearly perfect apples, but they're slightly misshapen or they're changing constantly. Now, if they're all different, how can they all be called apples? Because they're actually incredibly different. And the idea here is that there's something that unites all of these. And that's like the appleness. There's an idea that underpins all of these. So this might seem a little confusing, but really, I don't think it is. I mean, you could say this about anything, right? So there's no such thing as an ideal, perfect student. The only thing we have in this material world is lots of different instantiations or manifestations of students. We have this student, that student, that student, this student, that student. But what unites them all is this idea of being a student. So Plato is going to say that we've never seen the perfect student, we've never seen the perfect apple. So how is it that we can recognize this idea of a perfect form of a material thing? Well, it's because we are familiar with the forms, the perfect ideas from a previous existence. So this is the realm of appearances, and this is the realm of reality, and this is called the forms. So the realm of the real, the metaphysical, the stuff, the world that is beyond our worlds is the forms. Now, it's really important to realize this. No one has ever seen the forms. And you might want to just pause the video and think to yourself, why is it that you, according to Plato's philosophy, you can never have seen the forms? It's not possible for you to have seen the forms. Okay, well, the answer would be that the forms aren't available to the senses. The only thing that's available to the senses are appearances. So the realm of reality, accessible by reason only, is the real world. Outside of the cave, we'll look at that example for a second in a bit. So all visible objects are a poor reflection of these absolute ideas. So look, you have the form beauty, perfect idea of beauty. So this is represented here. Now we have the world of appearances, this world that we see and we can hear and taste and touch and smell. This is the realm of appearances. This is accessible by the senses, but this world is slightly less real. Things here are slightly less perfect. They're not as good. So why is it that we can recognize beautiful music, beautiful person, beautiful sunset? Because they all reflect or somehow participate, Plato says, in the idea of beauty. But this is important, they are not perfect. Each one of these is just a shadowy photocopy, if you like, of the original idea. Same is true for apples. Okay, what unites them, what makes them all apples, is they participate in this form appleness. but none of them are perfect. They're all shadowy reflections of this perfect idea. And it's the same with all things in the world. There's no such thing as a perfect chair. Okay? Chairs are very different. Look at this chair, look at this chair, look at this chair. What unites all these very different things is the idea of the perfect form of chair. This really is just an idea. It's an idea that we're born with, and it's accessible through reason. And I think Plato's point is that if we didn't have the forms, the world wouldn't be comprehensible. It would just be all of these weird, unique things that had nothing in common. So the forms sort of underpin everything, but they're only accessible through reason. So here's an example. Draw a circle. Now, it's impossible to draw a perfect circle. Even if you had a supercomputer, you can't draw a perfect circle. Because if you zoom in on the line, it will always be a slight combination of little straight lines. So really, it will be like a 1,000-sided shape. There's no such thing as a perfect circle. But you have the ability to think of a perfect circle. But as soon as it's put into the physical world, it's not perfect anymore. And this is because you have the form or access to the form of circle in your mind through reason, through being familiar with it from previous existence, but you can't ever see it in this world. It somehow becomes less perfect as it becomes physical. So how do we have the ability to think of a perfect circle? Well, it's because we used to exist in the realm of the forms. We have an immortal soul for Plato. So an immortal soul means our soul is eternal, it's always existed. But it has the misfortune of being inside a body. So it's inside a body for this life. And as soon as it goes inside a material body, it forgets. And it forgets the realm of reality, the idea of perfect and unchanging truth. But through reason, we can remember this again. Now, another argument that Plato gives in favor of this view, he presents in his dialogue Meno. And in the Meno, he asks a slave, a boy, and he's a slave, which means he's never been taught anything. He has no education. And Socrates presents, this is Socrates written through the dialogue by Plato, Socrates presents a geometrical problem to a slave boy who's ignorant of mathematics and geometry. However, the slave boy correctly solves the puzzle. Okay, so it's sort of, you know, if you have three sides, what's the length of the third? I mean, I'm not particularly good at maths, but what's the area of the shape? And he can work this out. He doesn't need to be taught anything about maths. He can work it out. And for Plato, this suggests that we understand concepts such as mathematics through recollection of knowledge established in a past life. So all knowledge is remembering. So Meno's slave boy is evidence for Plato. Now, criticisms of this, remember, you always need AO2. So you might disagree with Plato and say that we don't all have this perfect idea of beauty or justice, but we have very different, imperfect, changing, and culturally relative, subjective ideas. It also becomes logically ridiculous for there to be a form of every single thing. So if everything in the material world has a perfect version of it, does that mean there's a perfect version of poo? So that seems a little bit suspicious. So some people believe that Plato is not really on to the right thing here. Okay, so this is a reason that Michelangelo draws Plato pointing up, because Plato says this world isn't really real. It's the world above this world, the world that underpins this world, that's real, the forms. So trusting reason, not the senses, and the forms. That's what we've looked at so far. Next thing we need to look at is the allegory of the cave. An allegory is a metaphorical story that has a deeper meaning. And this isn't a real story. This is explored in Plato's book, The Republic. It's a simile, it's a metaphor, it's an allegory. Plato asks us to imagine that there are slaves, or prisoners really, that are tied to a wall here. And their heads can't move. They're forced to look forward. And they've been born in this cave, which means they've never seen anything else. The only thing they've ever seen with their senses are shadows. These are shadows cast onto the wall opposite them by objects and shapes and a fire. And Plato says, well, what do you think these prisoners are going to think is real? Well, they're going to take the shadows to be the only thing that's truly real, because this is the only thing they've ever been exposed to. He asks us to imagine that one prisoner is set free, and the prisoner escapes the cave, climbs out, and at first he can't see anything. His eyes haven't adjusted to the light. But then he sees the real world. He sees a world in 3D, a world in color, and it's like nothing he could ever imagine. And then the prisoner goes back into the cave and tries to tell the prisoners, the other prisoners. And they laugh at him. They don't believe him. They think he's an idiot because he's stumbling around, because he can't recognize the shadows anymore, because his eyes have been opened. And this is an allegory describing Plato's understanding of knowledge. Okay, and we're going to look at that in a second. So this is in Plato's dialogue, which is called The Republic. He wrote many, many dialogues, but possibly the most famous is The Republic. One of the most intellectually and historically influential works of philosophy. In it, Socrates, along with various Athenians and foreigners, discuss the meaning of justice and examine whether or not the just man is happier than the unjust man. So we're going to quickly watch the video. I'm going to try and play the video through the PowerPoint, so I'm going to keep it recording now. I don't know how good the quality is, so apologies if the quality isn't very good. If the quality isn't very good, just fast forward this bit and watch the video in your own time on YouTube. Okay, but I'm going to try and play it now. Okay. Imagine prisoners. Okay, so hopefully that was watchable. If not, watch it in your own time, please. So what's happening in this allegory? Well, all Plato is doing is he's telling us what we already know, or what he's already said. Just pause the video and just think to yourself, what do these things represent? The chains, the prisoners, the shadows, the escaped prisoner, and the outside sun. Okay, well, the escaped prisoner represents Socrates, somebody who has seen the real, seen the truth, and is coming back and is trying to help people to understand that their opinions and their beliefs are shadows. They're not true. They're not real. But remember, the escaped prisoner is mocked by the prisoners. They don't believe him. And this is true of Socrates. Socrates was mocked. People didn't believe him, and eventually they killed him. The cave represents our world, the world of appearances, the material world that's not really truly real. The prisoners are people chained by their senses. The chains therefore represent the senses. Things in the changing material worlds are the shadows. And the sun equals the form of the good, which is lighting up or exposing all the other forms. And we're going to look at that later, so don't worry about that. The objects represent the forms, the truly real things that are shadowy reflections for the senses. The fire or the sun up here, or the fire, represents the form of the good, which Plato believes is the ultimate form. The world outside is the realm of reality. So what is Plato suggesting about the world with this allegory? What is Plato suggesting about philosophy? Okay, so what I think he's saying here is the same thing he's been saying consistently, which is our world isn't truly real. The job of the philosopher is to wake up. The job of the philosopher is to use reason to escape the world of shadows. So Plato has a hierarchy of forms. He believes that the forms participate in the world, or the world participates in the forms rather, but behind the forms is the ultimate form, which is the form of the good. Now, this is incredibly difficult to make sense of, and that's partly sort of going to make sense in Plato's philosophy. We can't understand the form of the good, so if you're finding it confusing, that's because you've never seen it before. If you're finding all of this confusing, that's because you're like the prisoner. Your teacher, me, is trying to explain to you what it's like in the outside world, what the sun looks like, what fire looks like. But no one can really do that for you. You have to discover this through reason yourself. So if this doesn't make sense, then that's kind of okay. That's sort of in keeping with what Plato says. So Plato says there's some sort of form of good, which is like this eternal, constant source of energy. It's a bit like the sun. Obviously, it's not the sun, because the sun is a material thing, but he uses fire or the sun as a metaphor. Okay, so the form of the good illuminates or somehow makes sense of all the other forms. So before we can have the form of a car, we need to have the form of a good or perfect car. Before we have the form of luck or apple or person, we need to have the idea of a good apple, good luck, good person. So the form of the good sort of illuminates or makes sense of all the other forms. So the highest form is the good. The form of the good. In the allegory or the analogy, this is the sun. No one has or can stare directly at it. This is why it's quite a good analogy. If you stare directly at the sun, you'll go blind. So Plato's saying you can't really ever see it directly. You can only ever see its influence. It gives all the other forms their value because all things are good. All souls are immortal, and we can recognize shadowy reflections of the forms and the form good in the world because we once were in the realm of the forms. So in the cave, the prisoners in their previous life were once out here. So all true knowledge, all climbing out of the cave, is through reason and memory and remembering. Okay, so we have the forms, we have the cave, and we have the idea of the soul and reason. So let's now think about evaluating Plato's theory of knowledge. So sort of running up to the hour, so I'm just going to go through these ideas quickly. Here's a quick recap. So for Plato, it's not possible to ascertain true knowledge of the material world around us because it's always changing. True knowledge is only possible of things that are eternal and unchanging. These things can be found in the metaphysical realm and are known as the forms. The things we see around us are imitations of their ideal form. For example, we're able to recognize beauty and justice because of the ideal form of beauty and justice. The forms exist in a hierarchy with the form of the good, apologies, that should be there, at the top. The form of the good illuminates the other forms. Plato's theory of the forms can be found in his allegory of the cave, which can be found in one of his best-known works, Republic. Plato asks us to imagine a cave in which there are prisoners who have lived their entire lives in the cave. They're chained up looking at a wall which is lit by a fire located behind them. So this is sort of the second paragraph in any essay. As people walk behind them, the prisoners can only see the shadows of the objects. The prisoners represent most people, the chains represent our senses, and the shadows represent the material world. One day, one prisoner is released to the world outside the cave, where he is immediately struck by the brightness of the sun. However, soon becomes accustomed to the light and can see the world around him. When he returns to the cave to tell his fellow prisoners about the world outside them, they do not believe him. The released prisoner represents Socrates, and the sun represents the form of the good. The purpose of the allegory of the cave is to show people that there is more than merely the physical world around us, that we cannot trust knowledge through the senses. Discovering the truth is not easy, but is better than living an ignorant, unexamined life. So strengths and weaknesses, let's run through this. So strengths of Plato's theory of knowledge helps us to understand why there are imperfections in the world, encourages us not to accept things at face value, does provide evidence. The Meno boy, we do all seem to recognize the same ideas in abstract objects, beauty and beautiful things, for example. So the scholar Brian Davies would argue that without the forms, we would not be able to discuss, argue, or agree or disagree on general features of the real world, such as beauty or justice, because we'd have no knowledge or recognition of what these forms look like. Weakness. It's impossible to prove Plato's theory. How do you prove that there's a true world of the forms? Well, that's not a problem for Plato because he believes you can't, not through the senses anyway. But you might argue that's a problem. We disagree on what the forms are. So some people see beauty in other things. So some people believe that beauty is constantly changing. So one thing is considered beautiful 100 years ago and it's considered ugly now. Seems to diminish the world we live in. It seems to suggest that the world we live in isn't a good place. Modern sociology and psychology seems to suggest that we're taught about ideas rather than there being innate. So Plato's wrong here, arguably. If there are perfect forms for everything, does that mean there's a perfect form for unpleasant things like poo? Are the senses really useless? So Plato says the realm of the forms is more real than the material world we live in. We might want to disagree with that. That's up to you. For example, stubbing your toe feels pretty real. That's from the senses, isn't it? Feeling. So critics, Richard Dawkins, he says it's nonsensical to talk about a transcendent otherworld. Yes, the world around us is constantly changing, but we can still study it and its changes and gain true and valuable knowledge that benefits us in our daily lives. Aristotle, Plato's student, criticizes Plato. He says Plato's theory of knowledge becomes ridiculous if it's pushed to its extremes. Yes, perhaps we can accept that there are ideal concepts, but if there are ideal forms of everything, does that mean there are ideal forms of negative qualities like hatred? Do we all possess a shared intuitive understanding of certain qualities? Some people think something's beautiful and other people think it's not beautiful. And Plato would say that's because some people are using their reason better. But do we agree with that? Brian Davies agrees with Plato and says without the forms we wouldn't be able to discuss general things. So how can we have a debate about justice if we don't all somehow have a preconceived idea of what justice is? A.J. Ayer criticizes Plato by saying, when we say that something is good or bad, we're not demonstrating true knowledge. This is just an opinion. We don't have an idea of good, we just have an emotional response. Can beauty, goodness, and justice exist by itself? Can there be a world of the forms? Another problem with Plato's theory is he says only philosophers can gain true knowledge. And this, some argue, is elitist. Elitist suggests that some people are better than others, and philosophers are better, and people who've had an education are better somehow. So do you think Plato's theory is convincing? Well, feel free to pause this video. This is a possible essay plan. Okay, so thank you very much, Year 12. I'll stop the video now. And next week we will look at Aristotle.